Book 1 of 2020 was Talking to My Daughter, A Brief History of Capitalism by Yanis Varoufakis. So this book was really, really good. I have become interested in the economy and in capitalism versus socialism due to the current political climate in Great Britain and the election that was happening and Brexit and all of those kind of things. I was wanting to understand more about economics because I'd also read a book on GDP, so it kind of sparked my interest. And so when I saw this book in Waterstones, I thought this looks really interesting, and I think I read a little bit of it and it did seem interesting, so I picked it up and bought it, and I'm glad I did because I really enjoyed it. What this author's really good at is making it accessible, because obviously he's writing to his daughter and his daughter's quite young. She's got no interest at all in him or anything that he's got to say about the economy, and obviously he's got a lot of expertise in this area, so it's almost like he's writing it for her to discover when she becomes interested in it. As we all do as we get older, we become a little bit more politically aware and a little bit more aware of economic factors and how they impact on the country. And so this author's really good at distilling things so that when you're reading it, you never feel like you don't really get it or it's too complex for you. Like, he does it in such a way that it makes complete sense, the way that he's writing it. And I think sometimes with economics, you can almost read something that seems really, really complex, but the way he writes it is really simple, and he uses really creative allusions to things. It's like, you know, the examples that he uses are not economic examples, they're like real world examples, so that you get the economy better. For example, he uses prisoner of war camps and like cigarettes, and the cigarettes were like their currency, and when there was demand for things it impacted that. So it was really easy to kind of understand what he was talking about. Now it's broken up into different sections, so that the first part is kind of like a historical contextualisation to almost discuss where capitalism began, if you will. So he talks a little bit about geography and about how the climate dictated the economy because of how crops grow. And there is actually a book that I've become aware of about, I can't remember what it's called, something of geography it's called, or Prisoners of Geography, I think. And I assume that this will talk about a similar thing, but essentially because if you're across, like wide across the earth, the climate's not changing very much, but if you're kind of going down, the climate changes a lot because you're going kind of further away from the equator or closer to it. So for example, somewhere like Britain, the climate's not really that much different depending on where you are, and similarly Europe, it's all kind of in a similar, you know, climate zone, if you will. But places like Africa that kind of go down, the climate just varies completely, and so therefore whether crops survive or not is impacted. So in Britain, it was very easy to plant crops like wheat and such like that, that then meant that there was a surplus, and all this kind of like surplus, this agricultural surplus, meant that you could have population growth, and through population growth you could mobilise armies, and that kind of almost explains why Britain and places like that were able to colonise places like Asia and Africa that were a lot bigger, and you know, climate was very different. So something as simple as the climate has affected like who kind of mobilises armies against who. So that was very interesting to read about, and it also explained where money came from and how debt was created. So because of this surplus of agriculture, because initially when people, obviously we started off as hunter-gatherers, and then we decided to kind of stay in one place and have agriculture. And then because we had this agriculture, we then got the surplus, which we never had before, because hunter-gatherers only gather what they can, you know, gather at that time and eat at that time. So the agricultural surplus meant that we had all these differences in you know, life. And because they knew that the grain was going to come in and they were going to harvest, they could almost work with like, oh, this is how much I owe, and they could like house it in granaries and things like that. And they talk about how didn't really have money as such, but they had like shells, and the shells were representative of how much grain they were owed and stuff like that. So, because obviously your grain's going to go off, and so you might as well kind of share it, and then people owe. And it goes into a lot more detail, but it explains where the introduction of money and debt came from. And then Varoufakis also talks about like the merchant trade, and how because of shipbuilding, merchants going across the globe and finding things like spices and silk and all things like that, that meant that there was kind of a reimagining of the antiquated feudal system, because these merchants were getting very, very rich, and the lords who owned the land and had, you know, the serfs, well, in fact it was before that, they had the land from the kings that had given it to them, and the people that lived there were not working for money. They just kind of worked because they lived there, and that was just always kind of what they did. But they kind of realised that they were poorer than what the merchants were, and so they wanted to kind of make more money and become richer. So they created the serfs in the feudal system, which was where the people that had worked the land all their lives were now having to either choose between being an entrepreneur and owning that land, and then doing what they'd always done, but then having to sell their product for profit, and then obviously paying the rent for the land as well. Or the alternative was to go and work in a factory, because at this point there was the Industrial Revolution. So you kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. You know, do you take the risk of, you know, the crops failing and you not being able to pay the rent on the land? And the lords were benefiting from this, because the land that they'd had for years, they were now making money from, and nothing had actually changed for them. They were just making more money. So it meant that the people that were, you know, the serfs, were kind of having to take on that worry of making money, and that worry of making profit, and that worry of taking that debt on, because they had to rent the land before they made the money on sheep, wool, or, you know, agriculture, whatever they were doing. And if they decided to go and work in a factory, well, they had to work for 14-hour days and without any holidays or time off or anything like that, just to make ends meet. So this whole situation created people having money worries and being in debt and creating the economy. And they couldn't do anything about it, you know, because centralised government would have controlled the serfs. They couldn't rebel and revolt and things like that, although there were a lot of that happened, if you know anything like about the history of the time. So you almost created, well, not you, but it almost created this situation where you're free from working against your will, but you have to work because otherwise you won't survive. You don't have that kind of belonging in a family house anymore, where you were a servant or you worked the land and you got your, you know, your place to live and fed and things like that. Now it was on you, and you were part of that, you know, that cog in the wheel of the economy. Then Varoufakis goes on to talk about market economy, so it gets a little bit more economic from that stage on, because it's kind of explaining where the economy's come from, how it's been created, how we became part of it, how capitalism, you know, happened. And essentially it's because people wanted to make more money, they wanted to be rich, even though they were very well off already. So he talks about the market economy, and he talks about the difference between goods and commodities, and how, you know, commodities are about their exchange value, and that anything can be made into a commodity. And it explains why, you know, for example, you can make a woman's womb into a commodity, because she can sell that kind of baby onto a couple that can't have children. And it explains, or kind of makes you understand, why people became commodities in terms of slavery, why people viewed people as it being okay to treat them as a slave and to make them work for them, because of this whole capitalist ideology. You know, it's because of capitalism that slavery happens so much. Although actually, would you say that because there was slavery before economy, but before capitalism, but it meant that there was more of a, you know, people had more of an exchange value, I guess. Then there was the talk about profit and debt. So because of Protestant challenging of Catholic ideology, it meant that debt was something that was not seen as a sin anymore, because Roman Catholics kind of viewed debt as something that was sinful, and so therefore it couldn't be part of a way of life, and so nobody was in debt. No, debt didn't really exist. But because of Protestants challenging that, it meant that it created the space to allow debt to happen. And actually, debt is quite good at stimulating the economy, because it's almost like borrowing from the future. So you're borrowing some exchange value from the future that you're going to pay back eventually. So, for example, in terms of like the sheep with the wool, that sheep is going to create wool for you that you can then exchange. So you might as well take on that debt that you can then repay in the future. So without that, there is no economy, because people need to borrow initially to create a business, to then make money, to then pay back. If they never did that, then there wouldn't kind of be those businesses like evolving or happening. It would kind of stagnate. And then Varoufakis talks about kind of how debt's sold, and talks about kind of, you could create shares and government bonds, and how this kind of relates to the banking crisis, and kind of talks a little bit about that. Obviously there are other books like The Big Short that go into it in a lot more detail, and I watched the film of that recently, and that was really, really interesting. Explained it a lot more accessibly and a lot easier than what the book does, because the book could get quite complicated at times. It does loads of kind of like funny, like this is who was it, somebody in a bathtub, Margot Robbie in a bathtub, to explain how this works. So it kind of does it in a kind of humorous way to make it understandable. But essentially what Varoufakis says is that the central bank is really instrumental in averting catastrophe, and they need to be kind of almost regulating the banks, because essentially the banks do help the economy by selling this debt, but if they sell it too much, you end up with the crisis and the catastrophe. He also suggests that you need to have debts written off if the person defaults, because otherwise nobody would take that risk. Because in days gone by in history, if you kind of had a debt and you couldn't pay it back, you were like sent to the workhouse, the poorhouse. What's it called? Was it the workhouse? Basically the places where you go to work and you end up not being able to get out because you can never repay your debt, and then you end up dying there. It's horrific. And so nobody would take that risk, so you wouldn't have that business, you wouldn't stimulate it, and most businesses do fail because it's quite difficult to kind of create a business and make money from it. So you would stagnate the economy if you didn't allow that to happen, which is why people can, file for bankruptcy. It helps the economy, even though it's money that, you're never actually going to get back. And he also suggests that the economy is self-perpetuating. So when it's based on people's optimism and how well they think the economy is doing. If people think that the economy is not doing well, it influences their behaviour, which then has catastrophic impacts on the economy. And it affects things like business and personal decisions. So, for example, if the bank feels like the economy is not doing very well and they decide to cut interest rates so that people will borrow more, so that they'll then create more businesses and whatever, what people actually respond to that with is, oh, the interest rates have been cut, therefore the economy is not doing very well, therefore I'm not going to hire more people for my business, I'm not going to take that business risk because I might then lose loads of money and my business might fail and all that kind of stuff. So it affects things. So if you it's almost like you have to do counterintuitive measures to make people think that the economy is doing well, so that they still make those business decisions that make it do well. So it's self-perpetuating. If you think the economy is going to do bad, lots of people who have money will take their money out of the bank, or they'll take their money out, they'll sell shares and things like that, and it just creates a problem. So, for example, in the banking crisis, when people started to realise that some banks were in trouble, people just withdrew their money, and then obviously that made them in more trouble. So it made them collapse quicker. So people's understanding of the economy and their optimism about it affects it and actually kind of makes it spiral out of control. And Varoufakis also talks about how there's a lot of kind of discussion about making currency apolitical. So because currency has a lot of political issues, deciding whether to bail out banks or not, it's political. And if you were to use something like Bitcoin that isn't political, obviously it's more of a democratic way of managing currency, there isn't any kind of state-backed insurance or intervention. So if there is a crisis, nobody can do anything about it. You're just going to lose all your money. So it actually isn't good to kind of base an economy on an apolitical currency, because you need that state intervention. You need those central banks to kind of help people. You know, if there was a banking crisis and it was apolitical and there was no influence from government, people would have lost all their money. They would have lost all their savings, and they would have just, you know, been completely destitute. But because of the bank's involvement, it meant that we all got to keep our money that were in the banks. And so it's important to kind of have that safety net, really. So overall, the book was really, really interesting. Obviously, I've not done it justice, but I've just kind of done an overview of what it discusses, because that might pique your interest. But I really, really enjoyed reading it. And whilst it is quite conversational, and obviously it's written for his young daughter, which makes it a little bit tiresome at times, it helps because it helps you understand it better. It's more accessible, and it's really easy and quick to read as well. Like, and it's quite enjoyable prose to read for that reason. You know, it can be quite dry reading about economics, whereas this wasn't like that. So I would definitely recommend it if you want to understand more about the economy, more about capitalism and where it came from, and why it's probably going to, you know, continue.